I mean, I think that Hawthorne is showing us sort of all of the angles. He's clearly showing us the excesses of the punishment. That's clear. He's not endorsing the kind of punishment that this community puts Hester through. But he's also not denying the reality of sin and guilt and shame. To the contrary, he's showing how they work out. So while he's acknowledging and depicting their undeniable reality, he's also offering us a chance to kind of look at, so given that undeniable reality, what do we do about it?
Hey everyone, you're listening to Sacred and Profane Love, a podcast in which philosophers, theologians, and literary critics discuss how literature can help us think more deeply about love, happiness, and meaning in human life. As always, I'm your host, Jennifer Frey. I'm a philosopher at the University of South Carolina, and I'm also a faculty fellow at the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. You can find me on Twitter at Jen Frey. I'm on Instagram at Professoressa Frey, and you can also find this podcast on Twitter. Our handle is at EudaimoniaPod. As always, I would like to thank my sponsors for their support of this podcast. First and foremost, the Institute for Human Ecology underwrites this podcast. If you don't know about them, the IHE is the nation's leading academic institute committed to research into the economic, cultural, and social conditions vital for human flourishing. To learn more about the IHE, you can go to their website, ihe.catholic.edu. And I'd also like to thank the Lamp magazine and the Point magazine for their support of the work we do here on Sacred and Profane Love. As a $10 patron of Sacred and Profane Love, for example, you can get a free digital subscription to either the Lamp or the Point magazines. I subscribe to both magazines. I think you should as well, but I'm also just very grateful to both of them for their sponsorship. And if you want to become a $10 patron, just go to patreon.com/eudaimoniapod to sign up. All right, I am pleased to get to episode 54 of the podcast, which is with Karen Swallow Prior on Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. As always, I hope you enjoy our conversation. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Sacred and Profane Love. I'm super excited this afternoon to be joined once again by Karen Swallow Prior. Karen is a research professor of English and Christianity and culture at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. And she's the author of many books, but my favorite book of hers is On Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through the Great Books. And this is her second time on the podcast. She was with me. When was that? I don't even remember. When did we do this?
Did we talk about Heart of Darkness?
We did, but
then I think it would have been 3 years ago.
Oh my gosh, that's insane.
Yeah.
Well, welcome back to the podcast, Karen.
Great to be with you again.
Yeah, I'm just, I am so excited. I was just saying that I've been teaching Aquinas all morning, and now it's just, Puritan America. And, but it's interesting because I was talking about sin this morning. We're in that part of the Summa where we're talking about angels and the fall of the devil and how on earth could this happen. And also creation and evil, and what's the difference between the evil of guilt versus natural evil. And yeah, so I'm just very excited. I was telling my students, I'm like, I just finished the most incredible story about guilt that I've ever read. I bet you've read it, The Scarlet Letter. So that's what we're going to be talking about. I have not read this since high school. I just reread it. And it's amazing. I'm very surprised by how much I love this novel.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, you're not an Americanist. So this isn't like your specialty.
Right.
Like, why did you? And I should say that we're doing the, let's see, you have this new edition of The Scarlet Letter, A Guide to Reading and Reflecting. I'm just trying to see who published this.
B&H Publishers.
B&H. Yeah. So it's part of a series, right?
Right. And as you said, I'm not an Americanist. My specialty is British literature, 18th and 19th century, which is the English novel, which is my specific specialty. And so all of 5 other books in this series that I edited are all British. They're ones I've known and loved and taught for years. And, I picked the ones I love the most, but then I also wanted to pick ones that that I thought readers would want an introduction to, and also that have, of course this is true of all classics, but that say something very specific to us today in this time and place. And I think guilt and sexual sin and religion in general are, we're all grappling with these things in one way or another in our culture. So, and I just thought, well, I'll throw in a token American novel. So
why not? Well, I think you picked a good one. Like I said, I hadn't read it since high school. And I liked it in high school. I remember liking it, but it just lands very, very differently for me now. When I was in high school, I was an atheist, and I read this, and what I took away from it was I think I took the wrong thing away from it. And I think what I took away from it in high school is what a lot of people take from this novel, which is that this whole concept of sin is incredibly oppressive. And look at what happens when you operate under this incredibly oppressive concept of sin. It's very bad. Don't we all feel so good about ourselves now that we don't have this? And I now think that was a profound misreading of this novel. I don't think that's the takeaway.
In fairness to you, and I don't mean to be overly critical of high school English teachers. I was one year. But I think this novel is taught that way a lot. That's sort of, and it's there. The criticism of religion, the criticism of our Puritan history specifically is there. But there's more than that that's there. It's more complicated than that. Yeah, but it often gets reduced down to the anti-Puritanism.
Right. I think it's way more complicated. Even if you take the religious angle out of it, I think there's something very complex and human going on in this novel that, we're meant to pay attention to. But I think that when I read this, when I was 16, so that was a good bit ago. But I think it was taught alongside The Crucible, this play by Arthur Miller. Right. And so I think there was also this element of kind of out of control shame, this kind of out of control, or maybe what now we would call cancel culture. We wouldn't have called it that then, but it's sort of the same thing. It's sort of this McCarthyism, like this need to, this sort of dark impulse to shame people in ways that are quite extreme and can take different forms, whether it's rooting out the communists or
the witches.
Yeah, or the witches, right? And
or the adulterers, right?
Right, exactly. So maybe there's so much that I want to talk about, but I think maybe one place to start is to talk about Hawthorne just a little bit. It's kind of, so he comes from a long line of Puritans, and didn't he live in Salem, Massachusetts, or around there? Or he's like connected to this,
right. His ancestors came over on the boat, and he lived in the same region of the country where they had lived in New England. Which is funny because I grew up in New England, and it really wasn't. It's not until much later in life that you think, oh, New England was named after the old, it's the new one, not the old one.
Right.
And so those connections, that's what New England considered itself part of England when it was first settled, and that Puritanism continued. But what I see in Hawthorne, because he traces his Puritan ancestry back to a great-great-great-grandfather, and his great-great-grandfather participated in the Salem witch trials as a judge. And this is one of the really relevant themes for today is, I think he's like ashamed of his family, right? He's ashamed of his heritage, his roots, his religious background, and he's working that out. And you don't have to spend 5 minutes on Twitter today before you see people who are doing the same, like working out their own shame of their roots, their origins, their previous, their family traditions and religion. I mean, this is something many people go through.
I mean, is he kind of, so why do you think he writes this novel? I mean, beyond just sort of working through some kind of inherited guilt.
Well, I think, and not to overly psychoanalyze, Hawthorne as a writer, but the themes and the story itself, I mean, they're ripe for being told in America at this time, right? Because he's writing a story that's about early America before it even became a country, but he's writing it in a moment when America was still a new country and it was, sort of striving for its own identity. I mean, again, if America was a child or a teenager, it too was kind of struggling against its past and trying to forge a new future that throws away some of the old traditions. And so writing in this, living in New England, having this Puritan past, being born, I mean, it's so funny that Hawthorne was born on the 4th of July, right?
Oh, was he really?
Yeah, he was. He was born on the 4th of July, 1804 or 5, I think. I'm not good with the years, but in the early 19th century. So America's, not even 50 years old. And he's there in sort of the heart of America, where it began. And everyone's kind of wrestling with what is America? What is the American dream is sort of emerging or is gestating. And so this is a perfect story to explore America's past, a family's past, and its future. And it's, it's also the kind of story that Hawthorne and other writers in the American Renaissance who are transcendentalists and interested in the spiritual themes and in symbols, and all of them were. And so he was part of that group of writers. So it was just it's so reflective of this moment in American history, which is why, some would say it is one of, if not the great American novel.
Right. Yeah. It's really good. But let's talk about transcendentalism and sort of the intellectual circles that he is running around in Massachusetts. If you could just distill that down.
Yeah. So again, my specialty is British literature. So it helped me to think about transcendentalism as kind of the American version of Romanticism. And so there's in both Romanticism and Transcendentalism, there's, kind of a rejection of or reaction against the overemphasis on rationalism that sort of defined the Enlightenment of the previous centuries. But in the American context that Hawthorne was in, again, it's also tied into sort of this future of America. I mean, so many of the Transcendentalists were right there in Salem, in Boston. They were all living and writing there. We think of Thoreau and Emerson, but also Louisa May Alcott, Emily Dickinson. I mean, that place yielded all of the not ones that I know anyway, the 19th century writers. And yet what's interesting about Hawthorne is he really didn't adopt transcendentalism. He married a transcendentalist. His friends were transcendentalists, but he was kind of an outsider. He wasn't a Puritan. He didn't really seem to profess any kind of faith or religion, but he kind of, drank from all of the different wells and absorbed them. And that's maybe a weakness, we might think, we who are, have strong commitments. But that also, I think, is part of the gift of this book, because he doesn't have this personal commitment to any of these ideas. So he explores, he's brilliant enough to explore them and to look at the tensions and the ambiguities, because he doesn't really have a personal commitment to them. And so that gives us the chance to look at some of those ambiguities and tensions that we might not as readily recognize.
Right. So he's not going for a kind of realism or a kind of rationalism. I think in your introduction, you say it's in the genre of romanticism. But I just wonder if you could say more about what that means in terms of writing a novel. Because another thing that's interesting about this novel, and also a little bit weird, is the first chapter It's like a frame narrative. It's funny that the last episode I did with you was also a frame narrative. That was completely by accident, I think. Right. But, why does he set it up that way? And, how does that kind of color how we read the text?
Yeah, so we'll start first with the idea of it being a romance. And actually that his original title was like The Scarlet Letter, a romance. And romances are, very closely linked to novels, but they're actually older than novels. They're one of the streams from which novels come. So if you think of the Arthurian legends, those are romances.
Yep.
They're adventures. And they deal with a lot of sort of sweeping situations and characters as types. So black and white, idealism, dragons, witches, good guys, bad guys, white hats, black hats. Mm-hmm. I don't know the Star Wars reference, but
yeah. Well,
some of them are good and some are bad.
Yeah.
Right?
It's kind of more like legend. I mean, would you say that?
Yeah. Legend, but also that idealism that now Hawthorne, he transcends that, no pun intended. But, it's like the characters in romances tend to be black and white. They're good or they're bad. They're not. What the novel does is comes along and in a realistic way complicates things and presents what Samuel Johnson famously fretted about, like mixed characters. Like those were risky because that's what we were like. And so Hawthorne called this a romance, and he's not striving for the kind of realism that the novel, say, over in England or in France, was developing and turning into. Yet I think, this is a novel. Even if he was writing a romance, there is enough ambiguity and complication, I think, to lend it a kind of realism. But and in some ways it really is, and this is why it gets taught a lot, I think, in high school, not only because of its place in American literature, but it's not that long, right? It's a longish tale, mm-hmm. A shortish novel, mm-hmm. and tales were what he'd already written. And so in some sense we could say it's a long tale and it's unified in that way, except for this, for the custom house part, which is so vexing. And yeah, I tried to parse that out in the introduction and talk about it and connect it together. And basically, Hawthorne is, he's setting up the story by creating a narrator. As you said, this is a frame narrative. He gives us a narrator who tells us that he stumbled across the papers that tell this story, right? Which actually also lends it some realism, because it's like, well, I didn't make this up. This was just what I found in this trunk somewhere. So, in the 1600s, these events happen. And then 100 years later, somebody writes them down. And then 100 years or something after that, our narrator finds them and tells the story. But the narrator is actually of the Custom House is actually a lot like Hawthorne, biographically and, rhetorically and so forth. Mm-hmm. So there's, he's drawing on his own experience working in a custom house.
Yeah, I mean, chapter 1 is very long. Like I was like Conrad's frame narrative, like it's short. It's sort of like just sets it up and then
a couple paragraphs.
This is like 90 pages. Like, I mean, so and I have to be honest, I found it a bit of a slog. I don't love chapter 1. I mean, why does he spend so much time going over the custom house and it's so dreary and
No, I don't love it either. I mean, I don't, there are a number of works that led me to British literature, and this might be Moby Dick and this one maybe, but
yeah.
I think, again, this is the part, and I'm not big into biographical criticism, but this is kind of where Hawthorne's being political. I mean, he had lost his job. Being in the custom house was a political appointment. And so a lot of his life was very connected to the politics of the day. Later on, he becomes an appointee of President Franklin Pierce, whom he went to school with or went to college with. And so he's actually in this introduction, he's taking a lot of stabs at the politicians and the political situation of the day. I mean, I guess in some ways, he's being a little Dante-esque here. Like there are so many, he's reflecting the actual, some very particular historical facts, but in the guise of this sort of satirical story. So it's not the best, but it's it's part of the work, and that's the question to ask: is what to me the strength that it adds to the work is that it gives us there's a link between the narrator of this story and the story that follows. And I think I ask in the questions. This is the part that sort of shed the light for me from the introduction, just for anyone who's going to slog through it, is when the narrator says that moonlight in a familiar room is a medium the most suitable for a romance writer. Now that's that he's describing a setting in the custom house, and he's again this is Percy Bysshe Shelley, who talks about, that poetry lifts the veil of familiarity so we can see things anew. And so this is in some ways Hawthorne's version of it. So he's very much rooted in the politics and the particularities of his time, but he's trying to sort of see it through a different light by writing a romance about these very historical, real things that happened.
Does he have, in doing this, I'm just wondering, does he have any ambition of giving something to American letters that in Europe they can take for granted, right? So, the novel in Europe grows out of this stock of whatever, sagas and legends and romances and epic poems. Is he trying to give us something similar to connect us to our past? Or, I don't know. Or is that a stretch?
I think he is. He lived amid all of these great writers. He was one of the first, but he even expressed in his journal, I don't remember if it was a journal or a letter, but he wrote down when he went off to college that maybe he'd write the great American novel. So he really was consciously trying to write something that would be great, obviously, and also, kind of offer a voice of this for this newly emerging and developing country. So I think he was trying to do that.
Yeah. So let's get to the actual story. Which, as you mentioned, is 200 years in the past from the time that Hawthorne is alive. So in a sense, it's like a historical novel, but in a sense, it's not. It's like a little bit tricky genre-wise, but it opens up with this very dramatic spectacle, right? That we're all more or less familiar with, and that is the spectacle of Hester Prynne, our main character, one of the main characters, going through this spectacle of guilt and shame on the scaffold. Why? It's such a striking, it's very powerfully written and very wonderfully done. Yeah, I wonder if we could talk about kind of how the story opens up.
Yeah, I love what you said earlier and drawing the connection to cancel culture and just, the public shaming that still goes on today. Because I think that's part of the reason why this resonates so much. We still want to shame one another. And so when we study American history and we read about, the scaffold and, it's not just ancient history. It's not just we may not use that anymore, but it's still something that we do. We still publicly shame people, and we still bear, that bear burdens of guilt and shame.
No, we attack them online now, right?
Exactly. And how much more public can you get than that?
That's right. Yeah, we have Twitter campaigns, and we definitely still do it.
And so here Hawthorne writes about this in a different time and place in such a poetic and powerful way, as you said. It's so memorable. that makes it seem foreign and in the past, but it's really not. It's because this is about the human condition. The scaffold might be digital now, but it's still a scaffold. And he right away is a lot of the conversation that's happening among the townspeople, right? It's not like just this woman on the scaffold. It's all of the people talking around her. And one of the things, when I was doing this volume, I hadn't read this novel for like 20 years. So, so I was coming back and reading it with pretty fresh eyes as well. And I mean, it just struck me how, the women are so hard on this woman, and they would have punished her even more. They're all talking about what they would have done or how much
because
more
that's what women are
gotten,
like.
Right? I mean, it's true.
We're so mean to each other,
right?
Yeah,
right. And so I think that kind of behavior comes when you're sort of when you are the people who are least in power, right? Like that's how we take it out. And so we're still that way. Because in many ways, some of the dynamics of our culture are the same as the one that Hawthorne is describing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's some things that are really interesting to me about how he sets this up. One is that we don't really know what's going on in the beginning. I mean, we know that this woman has committed adultery. She's got the scarlet letter A that she has to wear. She's being put on the scaffold so that everybody can heckle her and shame her. And of course, she also has this babe in arms. So she has not just the scarlet A that she herself has embroidered, right, on her chest. Right. It's actually, but that she has this living embodiment of her sin. And that is, in fact, at one point, Hawthorne says of her daughter, Pearl, that she is the scarlet letter endowed with life, right? She, so it's not just that she has like this thing on her chest, but she has this other human being that embodies her sin and her sense of shame. And she's holding the baby while she's on the scaffold. But we don't really know anything about the adultery. Like, we don't know the context. We don't know. I mean, we know she had sex, right? Mm-hmm. And we know that it was, outside the bounds of marriage. But we don't know anything more than that. And we don't know who the father is. Right. And, of course, people want to know. I find that interesting. Mm-hmm. They really want him to be shamed as well. And they seem very upset that she's on the scaffold by herself. Why won't she name him? And she refuses to name him. She says, would that I might endure his agony as well as mine. She's sort of like,
she's not going.
Yeah, I mean,
she's going to carry both of the weight for both of them.
She refuses. And so initially you sort of think, wow, she must have really loved him. Like maybe this was a torrid love affair and she wants to protect her beloved and, she's willing to suffer for both of them. But, it's also interesting because there's all of this dramatic irony because once it's interesting to go back and think about these opening scenes, well, actually a bunch of scenes in light of who we know is the father eventually, right? Which is how did you say his name? Is it Dimsdale?
Yes.
Yes. It's one of the, what would we call him? A pastor?
Yeah, a clergyman or minister. He's called a minister in the novel. Yeah.
Yeah. So, he's one of the religious authorities in the town.
Right.
In fact, he seems to be the most beloved religious authority in the town. And, it's so interesting because all these other people are so mad that she won't name him. Mm-hmm. And he's like, oh, her generosity of spirit. She won't name him. Right?
Well, this is one of the points that I think that never really in my experience, gets talked about. And that is how, in some ways, that is a more just approach than we often see today. At least, in my evangelical context, what you hear about a lot is how the fallen woman bears all of the guilt and shame. And especially if it involves someone who's a religious leader, like that is kept hush hush. And it's the opposite situation. So in some ways, I think what Hawthorne is revealing, whether even if their motives are wrong, is that they actually do want equal punishment for the man and the woman. And I think in today's culture, we actually don't have that as much, at least in my context. It's like the woman is supposed to carry, even if it's not, that's what ends up happening, is she carries most or all of the burden and shame. And so that strikes me because this is actually a positive part of Puritan culture that Hawthorne reveals. Like, they aren't just blaming her. They're like, no, you had a partner in this, and who is, like, they want them both to carry.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I mean, I was actually surprised because, it'd been a very long time for me in reading this, and I didn't remember hardly any of the details. And I was like, oh no, they're really after him too. And they actually seem willing to show her a modicum of mercy up to the point where she refuses to name him. And then they just get so mad that she won't do it. And I thought that was really interesting because it does complicate one reading of this, according to which, it's just a morality play about misogyny and how, I think insofar as that's true, it's certainly complicated. I mean, they really, the Puritans are portrayed on their own terms, I think. And as people who are taking this very serious, but that somehow get kind of darker motives start to take over for them. And so, I mean, for example, I don't think, although I'm super interested in what you think, but I don't think that Hawthorne is against shame.
Right.
Or thinks that notions of guilt are just like dumb and old fashioned. And I don't even necessarily think he rejects the concept of sin. So it's not like, oh, she didn't do anything wrong. Why are we being so fuddy-duddy? I think he takes seriously the idea that she did something wrong. And something that, if it's wrong, it's shameful. And that obviously you would feel some guilt, or there's some guilt attaches to that. It's not that he denies any of that. I think he's exploring ways in which that gets disordered in people and in societies where it becomes very extreme. The extreme forms of shaming her are just that. They're totally extreme and sort of wild. But also the total lack of forgiveness, the lack of mercy shown towards her and her daughter. And then also sort of like, there's no sense of like absolution or, like, what do you do with your guilt?
Right.
They just think, well, she just has to suffer with it her whole life. And that seems not right.
Right.
But I think
if it's just punishment, where's the resurrection, right? Where's the redemption?
Well, the thing is, the punishment's wildly disproportionate to the crime. Now, I don't know how the Puritans are thinking about this, but just from a Catholic perspective, sins of passion, sins of lust, they're sins. They're mortal sins, but they're not that bad. like if you're looking at, think of Dante's Inferno, right? Like lust, that's like right after limbo, right? We're not talking like the bowels of hell here.
It's treason. That's
yeah. It's something like murder, right? Treason. You like this stuff. It's like real injustices. That's what's really bad. But like, even if so let's just assume for the sake of argument, which I believe anyway, that adultery is a sin. What's a proportionate punishment, right? And this seems just like wildly disproportionate, right?
Right.
Let's just shame this woman and basically force her to live in exile for the rest of her life and refuse to in any way reintegrate her into our society and also her daughter.
Yes.
There's something very unhealthy about that. But what's so interesting to me about this novel is that it doesn't at all work out the way that it's intended to work out. And this only comes out when we see the contrast between Hester's very public shame, Hester's very public, I don't know if we want to call it penance, actually, because penance implies absolution or something. And she's never really given that explicitly. But she's forced to publicly wear her sin, wear her shame at all times. Now, by contrast, there are two other huge sinners in this novel, right? There's Dimmesdale as the actual father, who's the co-adulterer and the actual father of Pearl. But then there's this Roger Chillingsworth. Well, we should talk about him. But I think what's so brilliant about what he's doing is the contrast between Hester and those two men, right? Because those two men are actually totally consumed by their sins, literally kind of like eaten alive by it. And Hester, on some very deep level, is just fine. Right. In a way that they not only aren't, but can't be. And so, I want to talk about all this. I mean, let's talk about Chillingsworth. Like, who is this?
Right. And so we're not worried about spoilers, I take it, right?
No.
Right,
Everyone,
okay.
If you haven't listened to this podcast before, we're going to tell you what happens.
Right. So as you said, when the book opens, we know this woman is guilty of adultery. We don't know how or the circumstances or who the her guilty partner is, and then this man shows up, Roger Chillingworth, who as it turns out,
the stranger.
The stranger. He's like a doctor, a scientist, a physician of some sort, of a 17th century sort. And it turns out that, he is her husband who has been away for, I think, like two years. And that's what, so she's been by herself, and that's what allowed this adulterous affair to develop. But that Hawthorne is so careful that this picture, it wasn't, Hester had been abandoned by her husband, essentially.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's an extenuating circumstance, from, her sneaking off in the middle of the night to meet up with her lover. I mean, she was a woman who had been abandoned. She didn't know where he was. She didn't even know if he was alive. They didn't have email and Twitter to check in.
They did
those
not.
days.
Yeah.
They did not.
But also, it kind of seemed like this was something I was a little bit confused, and maybe I just missed something. But it's very clear, like there's this really intense exchange between Chillingsworth and Prynne. And she's like, look, I was always upfront with you from the beginning that I didn't love you. And he's like, oh, I've wronged you because I should have never married you in my advanced state of decay. So we sort of get this sense that it was arranged or somehow she was forced into this marriage.
Right. I don't think the details of exactly how it happened are included, but I mean, it wasn't necessarily that unusual, at that time. I mean, a woman just kind of would take whoever came along. But there was something, I mean, this comes out later because we learn that she's committed adultery. We learn that she has been abandoned by her husband. And then we learn that their marriage really was, in some sense, to use sort of Hawthorne's framework, unnatural, right? Because she was young and he was old, and he knew that she was not attracted to him. And so...
And he married her anyway.
And he married her anyway. Right. So in a way, that's kind of a sin, right?
And he acknowledges it. I mean, I found that really interesting. He was like, you know what? I've wronged you. I should have never, forced this marriage on you. Maybe force is too strong, but I should have never done this to you. And I think he means that. I mean, he says to her explicitly, the scales are equal between us, like the scales of justice. He's like, you've wronged me, but I've wronged you. But then he asks her to keep a secret, right? I mean, he wants no one to know that's right. Who he is.
Right.
He wants to just remain this mysterious stranger who wandered out of the woods.
And what she doesn't know, and we don't know at that point, that he's going to take revenge. Not on her, but on the partner in her guilt.
Yeah. So he's such an interesting character because, he's like this seeker of knowledge, right? Which he also says was wronging her. He's like, oh, I'm just like this old man, like into books. And I should have never, it should have been obvious that you were never going to be into me. But he's really passionate about knowledge, and that's what motivates him. But what happens to him now that he sees kind of, what's happened is that desire to know gets distorted, right? Like gets really distorted because now his obsession to know is driven not by awe or wonder or anything good, but by hatred and revenge, right? So the thing that's been motivating him his whole life has now become really corrupted.
Right.
And he becomes obsessed, right? With knowing, but like knowing things that I don't know that I would say he shouldn't know, but he certainly has the wrong motive in knowing them.
Right.
Yeah. So something like very dark is happening with him. And I could never really figure out at what point actually he like really gets on to Dimsdale as like,
well, that's an interesting part of the whole novel because so much is just sort of one thing slips and slides into another. It really, because I committed to including no spoilers in the introductions to this, I had to go and ask a group of readers. I was like, okay, so at what point do you all discover, because I couldn't remember, once you know who's the father of Pearl, like it all makes sense and you go back and once you know and you reread it, it's all there.
Yeah, it becomes a very different story once you know.
Right. I literally could not figure out where we're supposed to know because it's all through it. And so I think the same is true with some of the other interactions. Like, and that's part of Hawthorne's brilliance because in our own, it's so hard for us, like when we're struggling through something or we're facing something or we're caught up in sin, how can we really just go, oh, this is the point at which this was a turning point? Like maybe we can, but most of the time it's like, no, these things are a long time developing and growing. And like, we can't point at one spot in our life and say, oh, this is where I got caught up and consumed by this sin.
Right. Yeah. So but at some point he gets like, he becomes pretty certain that it's Dimsdale, and
well, he spends time doctoring him, right? Like he's going to take care of him, but what he's really doing is seeking this knowledge that you said, trying to sort of examine him, I think, in a psychological way. I mean, again, psychology wasn't even a field when Hawthorne was writing, never mind when the story takes place. So in some ways, I think what Hawthorne is doing is, in this regard, especially as far ahead of his time, so he doesn't even necessarily have words to describe what Chillingworth is doing to Dimsdale and how he's going about figuring out this sort of deep psychological, emotional truth.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, so we have Chillingsworth who, is going off the deep end with like revenge and jealousy. But then we also have Dimsdale. I actually think chapter 8 is one of the most stunning chapters of the entire novel. And that's the one where they decide that they're going to take Pearl. So we haven't talked about Pearl. We should talk about Pearl.
Right.
But they decide, for whatever reason, I can't remember like how this comes up, but they decide when she's 3 that they're going to maybe take her away from Hester and put her in a better moral environment or something. And so there's this kind of quasi-inquisition where they bring the mother and the daughter in front of the governor and some other people. And they're like, they're almost doing like a penny catechism sort of thing, where it's like, well, let's just ask you the questions and see if you know the answers. And one, I was so outraged when I was reading this because I was like, man, I bet my 3-year-old would probably just have a temper tantrum. And then what? They're going to take her away from me and say I'm a bad mother. But also, this is where Dimmesdale kind of, I think it's his first attempt to make good on what he's done. But it's interesting because he only steps in once Hester turns to him and kind of forces him to do it. It's not clear that he was going to intervene prior to her saying, like, you know me, right? You know my heart because you're my pastor. And tell them, that this child, she is my happiness and she is my torture, right? And it's like, yeah, it's a really, really, really striking. It's a really striking chapter, especially.
I think that. I mean, I think that it's not explicit, but I think that's where he responds out of guilt, right? Like, so he feels very guilty about what he's done and what, and about the possibility of Pearl being taken away. And so I think that, and Hester's words to him just speak that truth that he is guilty. And I think that's why he intervenes.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. And that's kind of his story, right? I mean, Dimmesdale is someone who literally dies of guilt. I mean, in some sense, he knows that he's the father. He knows that he belonged on that scaffold. And he knows that he's a hypocrite. And he is just carrying the weight of this guilt around with him. I think that weight gets heavier and heavier as time goes on. I think it's 7 years before he finally comes out and says, right before he dies, right, that, this was me. And I think that contrast between how Hester develops over those 7 years and how Dimmesdale sort of declines, right? I mean, I feel like Hawthorne is trying to say something there about the nature of guilt and the nature of shame and the nature of, how are we really supposed to bear and deal with these things?
No, he absolutely is, because not only does Dimmesdale's guilt literally kill him by the end, Hester really ends up kind of thriving. I mean, it's much more so than you would think, living in her little cottage and making a living through being a seamstress, and even comes into some acceptance by the townspeople in sort of a covert way. So I think that's one of the central themes of the novel is this difference between, guilt that's acknowledged and purged in some way, even if not in a formal religious way, and guilt that's just internalized and eats away at us.
Right.
And you see that.
I mean, I think, and this is why, I was, again, so blown away by this, because it's such a more complicated picture of sin than you might have thought it would be, right? Because actually, it turns out that Hester, in forcing to acknowledge her sin and being forced to do this kind of penance, she is able to live in a way that is like authentic and real. And yet she lives in exile, right? I mean, she does. I mean, she is in a kind of permanent exile, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
She's like in the community, but not really. And what kind of struck me when I was thinking about this is, this idea that Christians have generally of being a wayfarer, of being in exile here, right? Mm-hmm. And she's actually the only one living that in the story in an authentic way. Mm. And like, what do we make of that? Because it can't be that Hawthorne is saying, oh, well, it's really good that she was forced, on the scaffold. I mean, I don't think that doesn't seem like the right response. Nevertheless, like, she is so much better off than these other two characters whose sin isn't acknowledged and in fact slowly destroys both of them over time. So I just wonder what you make of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that Hawthorne is showing us sort of all of the angles. As you mentioned before, he's clearly showing us the excesses of the punishment. That's clear. He's not endorsing the kind of punishment that this community puts Hester through. But he's also not denying the reality of sin and guilt and shame. To the contrary, he's showing how they work out. So while he's acknowledging and depicting their undeniable reality, he's also offering us a chance to kind of look at, so given that undeniable reality, what do we do about it? And we certainly don't put people on the scaffold and exile them. I mean, there are so many layers of that theme of exile as well. I mean, in some ways, early Americans or the first Americans were exiled from their homeland. We do have the presence of the Native Americans, the Indians in the story, who kind of come and join the procession. They don't play a prominent role, but the fact that they don't play a prominent role but are there tells us Hawthorne is, he's aware of these layers of being in, being out, being in power, not being in power, abiding by the rules of a community versus not abiding. I think I point out in one of the questions how during that procession that happens later on the holiday, the Puritans were all dressed in their drab black and white because that's a rule. They allow the sailors and the Indians to break the rule. They can do whatever they want. It's just so interesting. So there's just aspects of the human condition and human nature that cannot be repressed. I think Hawthorne is he's showing us that.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about Pearl, because she is so Pearl is Hester's daughter. Well, Hester and Dimmesdale's daughter. And she's named Pearl because she was bought at a great price, this sort of biblical passage. She is often described as an elf child. Mm-hmm. She is always depicted as kind of wild and untamed and associated in various ways with the forest and the wilderness. What's going on there? There's a lot of symbolism there with Pearl.
Right. I mean, and there's symbolism throughout the book, and a whole set of symbols, as you pointed out, is kind of the symbols that are linked to the supernatural in a broad sense, and the more sort of sinister, witchcrafty type symbols that pervade Hawthorne's work and pervaded the Puritan imagination that he's writing about. So it makes sense in a historical way, but it also makes sense in the context of the story. I mean, the Puritans were just sort of obsessed with, witches and witchcraft and that kind of supernatural mindset, which of course, if we're Christians, we believe in the supernatural, right? And we believe in the spiritual realm. But again, what Hawthorne is showing is just the sort of slippery, ambiguous nature of this. I mean, Pearl is a little innocent child. She's not the guilty party here. And yet he paints, she carries all the symbolic weight because she is the direct result of sin. She's innocent. She's the result of sin. And what is sin but this, this darkness and this evil that's always associated with the supernatural. So it's brilliant to me because he picks up the ambivalence of what it means to be human. We're all born with original sin, and yet we're also, we aren't responsible for that in a sort of individual moral way, and yet that's still how we exist and part of our nature as human beings. So even though it's very obvious and writ large in associating Pearl with all of these different symbols of the supernatural and the evil and the forest and sin and guilt, that's kind of where we all are, when we're born.
Yeah, I mean, I think Pearl ends up symbolizing different things to different people. And obviously what she represents to Dimmesdale, right, is his own sin, which is compounded. So she doesn't just represent to Dimmesdale the sin of adultery, but the sin of, abandonment. I mean, he's not being her father, even though he is her father. Right. He is not, I mean, he's neglecting so many duties. Right. And he knows this.
And deception. He's continuing to deceive everyone in the town.
Right. Right. And it's so interesting because eventually he desperately wants her affection. Right. He wants her to embrace him, and she refuses initially, and then of course right before he dies, she finally
holds his
hand or gives him a kiss or something. But I think for him it's almost like he's looking for absolution of some kind, and he's looking to her for it. Like, can you forgive me? Can you still love me? Right, even though I've abandoned you and all of this. And so it's so again, the contrast is so stark between, Pearl and her relation to her mother and Pearl and her relation to her father. And the fact that Pearl is born an outcast in a way that none of them were for. I mean, she was born into this in a way that no one else in the story. It's not true for anyone else in the story. And it's sort of interesting to me. I don't know what you make of it, but she kind of just disappears in the end.
Right.
I don't know what you think of that. I don't know what I think of it.
Yeah, I think that, the story really is mostly about Hester and Dimmesdale, and the role that Pearl plays is what we've already talked about. Is she's Dimmesdale's mirror that makes it impossible for him to deny his sin, his guilt, his continued sin and guilt, and deceiving and hiding and concealing. And so, but I think she gets sort of a happy ending though, right? She disappears, but it's because she's married off. Yeah,
it's clear happily. That she's wealthy and married. But we're never given, we infer it somehow from things that end up.
Right.
I mean, we don't have any direct knowledge. It's sort of all wrapped in an air of mystery. But she gets out, and Hester doesn't. She comes back. Also for reasons that aren't ever clear to me. I mean, you would have thought that, okay, well, they'll both escape and leave, but Hester comes back. And it's not at all clear or even implied that she had to come back. Right. It seems like a choice she made.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a deep psychological truth in that, right? I mean, there's really nowhere for her to go. There's and we're just, this is her home. She has made a home here. I think that's part of what bearing her guilt publicly and her shame publicly allows her to do that Dimmesdale's not allowed to do.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, this is what I'm saying. It's so more complicated than I remembered it being. Sort of, she's somehow allowed to live authentically in a way that the other main characters, besides Pearl, are not, right? There's this amazing line. Well, there's this incredible scene where Dimmesdale gives this like final, speech, and then he dies. Very dramatic. It's sort of like, it's basically a deathbed confession. And it's interesting that he does that, actually. Because like he knows he's about to die. I mean, why bother in a way? I mean, if he were Catholic, I would understand it, but he's not. He's a Puritan. So I'm like, what? I'm kind of like, why bother? Like, what, why do you need to do this? But there's a clue. He says at some point, to the untrue man, the entire universe is false. And of course, he's describing himself as the untrue man because he's living a lie. And somehow he wants to escape that, even if it's just finally before he dies. He wants people to know the truth. And I think from Pearl, he wants to be forgiven. And then he also, there's this scene where he says that God hath proved his mercy above all in my afflictions. I was surprised. I mean, that's a very Christian thing to say, but it was unclear to me what our perspectives as readers is supposed to be on that, right? Because I'm reading this as a Catholic, and that makes total sense to me for someone to say, he hath proved his mercy above all in my afflictions. I understand this. But where is Hawthorne with that?
Right.
I was kind of struggling to know what he was trying to say there, and I wondered what you think about that.
Well, I think with all of these questions that he raises, I think he raises the questions, and I don't think that's again what makes this work so complicated and good. He doesn't give a clear answer. I mean, he's definitely, when Dimmesdale says that, he's saying something that you would expect even a fallen, guilty Puritan minister to say. Yet, a deathbed conversion is still a conversion, and that's what he's really having, right? He's repenting and confessing. And the Puritans believed in those, and the evangelicals and Victorians and all, not just the Catholics, the deathbed conversion is real and true and good and sad when it could have been taken place earlier.
But I'm sorry, but just so that I understand you, like, there's a difference between deathbed conversion and deathbed confession, right? So he's already a Christian, right? And I mean, so it's not like he's, finally accepting Christ in his heart or whatever.
Oh yeah, no. I mean
that he's confessing his sins, and I guess maybe, I mean, you can correct me if I'm just wrong about this, but I didn't think that Puritans thought you needed to do that. I mean, to confess, to formally confess and seek absolution and do penance.
Right, not in a formal way, but their whole lives were filled with self-examination. I mean, that's actually a whole other stream that the novel comes from, is like the spiritual autobiographies that people would write, or they would keep journals, every day reflecting. So it would be more private, but it still would be a confession. There was self-examination that would take place. I guess it just would not be as formal. It was considered really important.
This is a public, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is a public confession, and a very public, like, reaching out for forgiveness, and a kind of very public expiation of sins. And I think the thing that was unclear to me is what Hawthorne's perspective is on that, right? Like, because it's clear what his perspective is with the scaffold scene.
Right,
like, we're supposed to think that's bad,
right? Right.
But it's not clear. I mean, this scene, it's not so obvious how we're supposed to react. And my reaction is very colored by, my own faith and my own faith commitments, but those are not commitments that Hawthorne had.
Right.
And it's unclear to me if this is like the scaffold scene. Are we supposed to be horrified? It doesn't read that way to me at all.
Well, I think we have to, and we didn't do this, but we need to remember the earlier scaffold scene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's
what I'm talking about. Sorry.
Oh,
yes,
okay.
The earlier one.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's the earlier one
but that one's private. That one's, it's the family unit. It's not in.
Oh, that's right. There are three different different scaffold scenes.
So when
here.
Dimsdale and Hester and Pearl are out on, at night
in the middle of the night,
and he mounts the scaffold, and that's when his own self-imposed is revealed, which is actually kind of a Catholic thing, isn't it?
Yes, there's this. Yes, so there. Well, no, we're not like constantly like carving.
No, but I mean the whole. But no, the self-flagellation or punishment, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, so yeah, so like it was certainly a medieval practice.
Mm-hmm.
And but it's super interesting because somewhere in the middle of this book, I'm sorry because I can't remember exactly where, but he's talking about how Dimsdale reverted to like popish practices, and I thought that was so hilarious. But yeah, I mean, he's suffering under the weight of this guilt, and he's like trying to punish himself, as I don't know, as a way of like trying to balance things out cosmically because she was so, brutally punished for so long. And then in some sense he got away scot-free, but on a deeper level, not at all. Right. I mean, what I find so interesting is that he is suffering on such a deeper level because of this sin than she is. Right. And he is suffering a sense of shame that is so much deeper than she is. Mm-hmm. And the difference seems to be that his sin is private. Right. It's not
right.
It's not being acknowledged. And so, he's not a true man. Right. I mean, that's what he says.
Because going back to the beginning and the whole thing, the townspeople are pressuring Hester to reveal who her guilty partner is, and she doesn't. But he could have at any point. I mean, even at that beginning. Right. So she, I think it would be a legitimate reading to say, OK, she's being self-sacrificing and self-effacing by not revealing her partner in crime. Well, also, you know what? She's saying you be the man.
Yeah.
You speak, and I'm not going to do this for you. You need to do it. He could have at any moment, any day, and before the end confessed his role, and he doesn't. Mm-hmm. And so he does get the worst punishment.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting because like, let's take for granted that the sin was real. And maybe there were all kinds of extenuating circumstances, and maybe it's totally intelligible. Lots of sins are like that, and they're still sins. He is someone who possesses like real vice in a way that it's just totally unclear that she does at all. And that's the thing about sin. It might spring from vice, right? This kind of settled disposition to choose poorly along some dimension of life. It's just deeply unclear that was at all the case with Hester, right? I mean, we actually are never told.
Right. I love that Hawthorne never gives us any details about their relationship, about their liaison. Was it one time? Was it ongoing?
I mean,
like that obviously is not part of the point.
We certainly know that she's, for all we can tell, she was chaste the rest of her life.
Right.
So we don't have a lot of evidence that she was acting from lust in the sense of a settled, disposition. But he, we know, is a coward, right? Is a hypocrite, is like, I mean, he just comes off so much worse. And I mean, it really just seems that part of what Hawthorne is trying to show is, the truth of this claim to the, what was the quote? Oh, to the untrue man, the whole universe is false, right? I mean, he's an untrue man. Because in the specific sense that he does not live as he believes he should.
Right.
Right.
Right. And I think that's a point that regardless of Hawthorne's commitment or lack of commitment to any, philosophical or religious system, that's something that remains true that he's pointing out for all of us.
Yeah, it's so good. I just can't stress like how just, I mean, we can talk about the themes of the story, and obviously that's what we're going to do. But like actually reading this novel is a very powerful experience. I thought I could not put it down. And I think it's much more complicated than we make it out to be. I guess I'll leave like final thoughts to you. I mean, what's the ultimate takeaway for you?
Oh, that's a good question. So I think, I mean, there's so many takeaways in this novel, but I think the ultimate one is one that we've brought up a few times. It is just that sin is real, and and I don't mean just in the Christian sense. I mean in the fallenness, the depravity, the error that all human beings can agree that we are subject to.
We miss the mark.
Right. That it is real, and because it is real, so is guilt. And it's not just an individual thing either. It is something that has consequences for us in our lives together. And so that's how we deal with our own sin, other people's sin, and the guilt that inevitably comes is so important, not just as individuals, but in any community. And that's integral to the Scarlet Letter, is the role the community plays and how all of this plays out within a certain kind of community.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I got to ask one more question. I'm going to sneak another one in here. I mean, well, it's just so interesting to think about that in light of the place from which we started was, talking about this being, possibly the great American novel and sort of like what, its place in American letters and possibly what Hawthorne's ambitions were in writing it. Isn't it so interesting then that it would be about sin and shame and guilt?
And Puritan religion, right?
I mean, and not because it's not, I don't know, some epic heroic tale.
Mm-hmm.
It's not some great quest. Like when I think of the Arthurian romances, I think of some great quest, you got to get the Grail or whatever.
Or even Hawthorne's friend's novel, Moby Dick, right? Which is a complete, right?
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
It's about sin and shame and guilt. Anyway, there's a lot there to ponder, I think. And we can leave it there. Thank you so much, Karen. This was really delightful.
Oh, thank you. This was a rich conversation. Thanks for having it.
You have been listening to Sacred and Profane Love, a philosophy, theology, and literature podcast that is generously underwritten by the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America and produced by Catholics for Hire, a group of young Catholic digital content freelancers. Special thanks, as always, goes to Will Dethridge, Bea Kwasai, and Joe Coleman for their work in editing and producing this podcast. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider supporting us by giving us a positive review on iTunes or on Spotify or wherever you listen, and also by becoming a monthly patron at patreon.com/eudaimoniapod. Patrons enjoy many benefits like tote bags and coffee mugs with exclusive Sacred and Profane Love artwork, and also at the $10 level, free digital subscriptions to either The Lamp or The Point magazines. For our next episode, I will be joined by the historian Christopher Snyder to discuss J.R.R. Tolkien's fiction and Aristotelian virtue ethics. Until then, friends, be well and keep reading.